And let's raise a purchase invoice and assume that that came in through document capture. Now I'll do it manually and say it's for vendor 10,000, some invoice number. And the way we would get it is on the level of a GL account. And now in my British database, this would maybe come in at this account number, which had a 0 too much, but I'll put it on miscellaneous expenses, and it would be subcontracting for something, and we would get maybe a quantity of something, or maybe it's just a single one and saying this is for 5,000. This is probably what it would look like when we get it from document capture, right? This is what it would be able to map in. Maybe there's a few other fields, but basically this is it. And then we can say, yes, somebody needs to look at this and decide what project is this for. In this case, we say it's for maybe the installation project that we had previously. And if this goes on to some costing task, this is for rigging. Something, doesn't matter here. These two fields, they would need to put in on every single invoice, unless you can get that out of document capture. But I don't see any way you could do that, because probably the subcontractor doesn't know. Maybe they know the project number, but they probably don't know the task number. That's what we've seen in the past, at least. So with this given, this would be a proper invoice. The one issue we have here is that we do have a requirement of an expense code and an expense payment type. But there is no usefulness in having somebody put in these two fields every time they do an invoice. That's just silly. So unless there's a need for it, and the need could be that they say we want to somehow use these to signify something about recharge rates or add in a margin or something like that. But as they're not directly recharging anything to the end client anyway, I don't think it matters. So what I would do is say, I would leave these blank. And there is an extra field in project setup, or actually two fields. So they're actually in the invoicing section. Purchase expense payment type. So this is a default expense payment type that will be used on purchases when no other is set. So I can put in an expense payment type, and now I'll use employee. I know that doesn't make sense. You'll probably create one that you call purchase or AP or whatever it is. I just have one for employee. And the same for the expense code. This is also a default code that can be used when nothing has been filled in. So I can put in and say, yes, I want to say, if I don't fill anything in, then it's office equipment. Again, I would create an expense type that I would call general purchases or unspecified purchases, because it doesn't matter what expense code we put on. So the thing is, if I go back to my purchase invoice here, we look at that and we say, now we don't select anything. Then it doesn't change anything. If I go in here and say, well, actually, I want to fill something in. I want to say this is for employee and this is for restaurant and food. Then selecting the expense code will also select the GL account for me, because there's a setup. So the real idea here was to make it easier for people not to know about all the different GL accounts, but they could simply say, what kind of expense is it? And then that would select the right GL account. And that could even be on a project by project basis. So on one project, we use one GL account. On another project, we use another account. Or for a certain type of work, we use a third account. So it's a kind of indirection, simple, a bit like you can select an item and the item has posting groups, and those posting groups determine which GL account to post to. But it kind of becomes reverse if you have the scenario where you already have the account. Then now I'm lucky that my restaurant food is actually also miscellaneous expenses. But if I selected something, then I would get another account, which might not be the account I want. And so here it actually makes sense to not maybe fill these in, because I do want to select the GL account on my own. Let's just take the scenario of actually getting an invoice just to finish this off, because if we do this for items, it doesn't matter. There is no expense code. It's only for the case of the GL account, whereas this makes it easier, because if I don't fill it in and now I post it, then at the last minute of posting, if I still don't have an expense payment code, an expense code here, then it'll look at the setup and fill those in, but it'll not do any changes to what account it is. It just becomes a last second attempt to to put on something to allow it to post through, because if it wasn't filled in, then it would not allow, and I'm missing something in setup. And we can actually see here it actually did fill them in, but then my posting failed because these were my defaults. Let's take this project 11 and budget for some purchase on it. So I'll go in now. There's absolutely no budget here, but let's go in and say, let's budget for some subcontractor. And now we're in an initial estimate budget version. This we need to keep track of. We say, I don't want to resources. I'm not caring about items. We're just saying expenses. And of course, I should have an expense category, which is to select from this list. And of course, I'll take something. I'll say, hey, this is office equipment, but it should be, you should have an expense code called subcontract. And that could be one, it could be multiple different kinds. You could have electrical subcontracting, fiber contracting, whatever kinds of contracting. You decide how you break that down. And that allows me to go in and then say, well, we want to spend 5,000 on subcontracting in May. Now I'm doing this with a matrix, so I don't get a description on this entry. If I've gone in instead using the budget journal, I could do that as well. So let's go for an edit journal. And now I have this. I'll delete all the lines. And we will say for our project 11 and for task factory slab, I need an expense. Let's actually take hotel this time, just to take another. And here I could say electrical subcontracting. So here I can make the description, right? So I have the details of what it should cost 5,000, or I could say this is maybe 50 at a rate of 100. I mean, you can do it either way, but now we get a budget entry for this. We will have two budget entries on our budget. One for 5,000 here we created from the matrix, one we created via the journal. Doesn't matter. I mean, they're both for 5,000. From that, we can raise purchase orders. And in order to make that possible, we need to define on the project card what budget version we want to use as a basis for purchases. And that is defined in the budget. And here we actually say the planning integration. This is the budget version we use for purchases. In standard BC jobs, you of course have planning lines, and you don't have different versions of your planning lines. There's no single set. But here, because we can have multiple versions, we cannot say we sometimes purchase based on one budget version, we sometimes purchase based on another. We need to have a single budget version, which is the one we use for purchases. Not saying we cannot have multiple budget versions for comparison reasons, but for planning, it needs to be one. It cannot be that as we change the budget versions, our demands just change. So here I have to set it to my initial estimate, because that is now my budget version that I'm using. And so with that, I can go in and say budget planning update. I'll get a list of all the budget entries, and I can say, are there some of these where I would like to have them be the basis for purchases or production or any other kind of requisition? Yes, actually, both of these I would like to take. So I need to set up a expense payment type. That was the one I said I don't have that one. I'll do that one later. So I'll create one for purchases, and I'll say this is a company paid AP purchase type. So company paid purchases. And I will need to also do a bit of setup for that one. So that would be in my project expense posting setup, where I define the different combinations of expense codes and payment types. And so I could say here and this is actually date controlled. That seems a bit excessive to me, but that's the way it was done. And I could say that for hotel and purchase, that goes to miscellaneous expenses account, and for office equipment and purchases, hey, maybe that also goes to that account. You need to create this kind of setup. So it is a mapping from an expense code in combination with a payment type to an account. And you can see you can even control it by project. So you could have different accounts used for different projects, or even for different task codes. I don't see that used very much. And so back to my project here, I'll do my budget planning update. I'll select these two, copy and update, and it should create 2 planning lines for me. But now I have 2 planning lines. The planning lines are basically the same as in standard BC, but they do come with some special features. So we can see we have our office equipment, which one was with more of a lump sum, the other was electrical subcontracting. And what I can do in here is say, I'll put on a vendor number and say, this will be for this vendor. Maybe this is for the same vendor. Well, if it's items, you can do it, of course, on the item card, but expense cannot have a default vendor. That is the upside to using service items, that you get that default. But then the question is, can you track that back when you get the invoice, that it is an item line? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Pros and cons. I'm very much a fan of service items or non-stock items. And so what that will do is it will create a purchase order with those lines on. And this could be an expense, but it could also be items. If I budgeted for items, then it would create 2 item lines. So then I can send that off, I get it back, I receive it, or probably I get an invoice and get an invoice match via Continua. So that is a possible option. And so what we do see here is that it has filled in now my expense payment type and my expense codes, the one I used on the budget. Now, both of these happen to go to the same GL account because I'm posting everything to the same account, but these could, of course, be different accounts. For expenses, yes, it has to go that way because you cannot pull an expense through order planning. But if I budgeted for items and said, well, I need to have some item, and that will be some guest chairs, and I need 10 of those. And then I go for my updating. Then I can see now I have my item. I want to update that into a planning line. Then, of course, I get a planning line for my items instead. So now I also have my item, my guest chair. And here, then, of course, I can use some of the standard features of BC with order planning, a requisition worksheet, etc., to say, well, maybe I need to buy these in bulk. I buy the full container of office chairs every time I need them, and there's a lead time and there's safety stock and all that. I mean, I can go that route instead. Or I can go with saying, hey, we want to make a special purchase. Create a purchase order for it, just like we did before. But they're both options. I think it depends on what you're ordering. If it is something that is a special order for this project, we are ordering an electrical cabinet pre-populated with all the switches and whatever's needed, then make a special order from here. If this project requires 2 kilometers of networking cable, then that might go into order planning, because I'm guessing they are buying networking cable by the pallet and picking that up when they need it. So it depends on what kind of item they need. If it is a special item, and we go into, let's say, order planning and say calculate plan and see if we get some demand on this, and we did. So now we have the guest chairs, and it's saying for some reason I need 2. I thought I ordered 10, but maybe we do have something in stock. Then, of course, I guess if we had multiple jobs, we could combine those into one purchase. But then, of course, we need to also track the consumption, because then we are buying to stock. And then somebody needs to say, well, did we actually use them? So that becomes the difference. If you buy something directly for the project, as soon as and there are different options, we receive it or we invoice it, then it is consumed by the project. If we buy something to stock, then somebody needs to say, well, now we are taking this out of stock and having the project consume it and take the cost of that. That is a big difference. Just to recap, I think the important part here is to know that you will need to look at setup for what we call expenses. So these are the different categories. In this case, hotel mileage, you would have to have something else. And each of these in turn needs to be set up in the project expense posting setup in combination with the expense payment types you create. You will need definitely something for purchases, which is marked as expense posting AP and company paid, because otherwise you will get problems. So you need that. And then you need to set that up in this combination of things. And as I recall it, you must fill in the start date. I've seen strange things happen if you don't do it. And that has to be for all the combinations of the expense codes and the payment types that you will be using, giving those an account. So it becomes kind of a mapping. I think that's an important part. And of course, you can do special things with the expenses you set up. It's not just a code. There is a whole card behind it with different rules, and you can block them, and you can define cost types and base unit of measure, and you can even set pricing on them. But I think in your case, you won't. It will just be almost like a direct mapping to a GL account. An example is mileage. So here for mileage, for instance, I do have a rate on that where every mile costs a certain amount, and there will even be an outbound price if you're recharging those, or you can have things like that. I don't think you need any of that. I think for you, it will be just basically having the code and the name